In 1951, the most famous man in the world wasn't a movie star or a general. He was a frail, elderly Iranian aristocrat who often conducted state business from his bed, wearing pajamas. His name was Mohammad Mosaddegh. To the British Empire, he was a lunatic and a thief. To the Iranian people, he was a messiah. Mosaddegh had done the unthinkable. He had taken the world's largest oil refinery away from the British and given it back to the Iranian people. He challenged the idea that a Western power could own the natural resources of a sovereign nation. But in doing so, he set off a chain reaction that would lead to a secret war, a global oil embargo, and a betrayal that would change the Middle East forever. This is the story of how a struggle for oil became a struggle for the soul of a nation, and how that struggle was crushed by the shadows of the Cold War. The inheritance of resentment. The end of World War II left Iran in a state of wounded sovereignty. The British and Soviets had treated the country like a warehouse, leaving behind a legacy of famine, hyperinflation, and deep-seated distrust. The young Mohammad Reza Shah sat on a throne that felt more like a cage. He was surrounded by a parliament, the Majlis, that was increasingly tired of being a puppet for foreign interests. At the center of this resentment was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC. The refinery at Abadan was a city within a city, a British colony on Iranian soil. British employees lived in air-conditioned villas with swimming pools and tennis courts. Iranian workers lived in shacks without running water or electricity. In 1947, the AIOC earned £40 million in profit. They paid the Iranian government just £7 million in royalties. To make matters worse, the British government collected more in taxes from the company than the Iranian government received in total revenue. The math of empire no longer added up for the Iranian people. They wanted their dignity back, and they found their voice in a man who had been fighting for Iranian independence since the days of the Qajars. The rise of the old lion. Mohammad Mosaddegh was not a typical revolutionary. He was a wealthy landowner, a doctor of law, and a master of political theater. He was known for his emotional speeches, his tendency to weep in public, and his absolute, unshakable integrity. He led the National Front, a coalition of secular liberals, nationalists, and even some clerics, all united by one goal: the nationalization of oil. In March 1951, the momentum became an avalanche. The pro-British Prime Minister, Ali Razmara, was assassinated by a religious extremist. The Majlis, swept up in a wave of nationalist fervor, voted unanimously to nationalize the oil industry. The Shah, terrified of the crowds in the streets, had no choice but to appoint Mosaddegh as Prime Minister. The British were stunned. They had owned Iranian oil for 50 years, and they weren't about to let it go without a fight. The Abadan crisis. David versus Goliath. The British response was swift and brutal. They didn't send an army, at least not yet. They sent lawyers and bankers. They launched a global boycott of Iranian oil, threatening to sue anyone who bought a single drop of stolen petroleum. The Royal Navy moved warships into the Persian Gulf, a classic display of gunboat diplomacy. Mosaddegh didn't flinch. He took his case to the United Nations in New York and the International Court of Justice in The Hague. He argued that the oil belonged to Iran and that the AIOC was a relic of a colonial past. He became a global sensation, named Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1951, beating out Winston Churchill and Dwight Eisenhower. But back in Iran, the economy was collapsing. The British embargo was working. Without oil revenue, the government couldn't pay its bills. Poverty deepened, and the coalition behind Mosaddegh began to fracture. The Tudeh Communist Party began to gain ground, and the religious right, led by Ayatollah Kashani, began to turn against the secular prime minister. The shift from London to Washington. The British knew they couldn't topple Mosaddegh alone. They needed the Americans, but President Harry Truman was sympathetic to Mosaddegh. He saw him as a nationalist, not a communist, and he hated British colonialism. Everything changed in 1953. Dwight D. Eisenhower entered the White House, and Winston Churchill returned to 10 Downing Street. The British changed their pitch. They stopped talking about oil profits and started talking about the Red Menace. They convinced the Dulles brothers, John Foster at the State Department and Allen at the CIA, that if Mossadegh stayed in power, Iran would fall behind the Iron Curtain. The Cold War had officially swallowed the Iranian independence movement. The CIA and MI6 began planning Operation Ajax. The architecture of deception. The CIA's strategy was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They didn't just want to remove Mossadegh. They wanted to destroy his reputation. They funneled over $1 million into black propaganda. They hired Iranian journalists to write scathing editorials, calling Mossadegh a crypto-communist and an enemy of Islam. They even hired street thugs to pose as Mossadegh supporters and attack religious leaders, hoping to drive a wedge between the secular prime minister and the powerful clergy. The CIA also targeted the Shah's inner circle. They knew the young monarch was indecisive, prone to panic, and deeply afraid of his own people. They sent secret envoys to his twin sister, Princess Ashraf, and his wife, Queen Soraya, urging them to convince the Shah that Mossadegh was planning to abolish the monarchy. The pressure was relentless. The Shah was told that if he didn't act, the Americans would find someone else who would. Operation Ajax, the first attempt. The man chosen to lead the coup on the ground was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. He slipped into Tehran under a false name, hiding in the back of cars and meeting with conspirators in safe houses. His mission was to coordinate a military uprising led by General Fazlollah Zahedi. The plan was set for August 15, 1953. The Shah finally signed the royal decrees, firmans dismissing Mossadegh and appointing Zahedi. But the first attempt was a disaster. Mossadegh's intelligence service had been tipped off. When the Imperial Guard arrived at Mossadegh's house to arrest him, they were met by loyalist troops and arrested themselves. The coup had failed. The Shah, hearing the news, fled to Baghdad and then to Rome in a state of total collapse. In Tehran, the streets were filled with Mossadegh supporters tearing down statues of the Shah. It looked like the monarchy was over. August 19, 1953. The second wave. Kermit Roosevelt refused to leave. He realized that the chaos in the streets was an opportunity. He flooded Tehran with more cash, hiring renter mobs from the city's poorest districts. These mobs were instructed to shout pro-Shah slogans and attack anyone who looked like a Mossadegh supporter. On the morning of August 19th, the tide turned. The paid mobs were joined by military units that had been bribed or convinced that the country was falling to communism. They marched on the Central Telegraph Office, the radio station, and finally, Mossadegh's private residence. The battle for Mossadegh's house lasted 9 hours. Tanks traded fire in the narrow streets. Hundreds of people were killed in the crossfire. Finally, the gates were breached. Mossadegh, ever the dramatist, escaped over a back wall as his house was looted and burned. He surrendered the next day, famously saying, "I am the legitimate Prime Minister of Iran, and I will remain so until the people tell me otherwise." The return of the king. The Shah flew back from Rome, no longer a spectator, but a monarch who owed his throne to foreign intelligence agencies. The oil was denationalized, in all but name, with a new consortium of Western companies, including American ones, taking control of the taps. Mossadegh was tried for treason. In a defiant final speech, he said, "My only crime is that I nationalized the Iranian oil industry and removed from this land the network of colonialism and the political and economic influence of the greatest empire on earth. He was sentenced to 3 years in solitary confinement and then spent the rest of his life under house arrest in his village of Ahmadabad. The legacy, a poisoned well. The 1953 coup was a tactical success for the West, but a strategic catastrophe. It destroyed the secular democratic center of Iranian politics. By toppling a popular, constitutional leader, the US and Britain sent a message to Iranians. Democracy is a luxury you aren't allowed to have if it interferes with our interests. The Shah returned as an autocrat. He created SAVAK, a brutal secret police force, to ensure that no one like Mosaddegh would ever rise again. But by crushing the secular opposition, he inadvertently cleared the path for the only institution he couldn't fully control: the mosque. The seeds of the 1979 revolution were planted in the ruins of Mossadegh's house in 1953. The bridge to victory had become a bridge to a very different kind of future, one defined by West oxification and a growing rage that would eventually explode. The cliffhanger. Next time, in Part 4, the Revolution. The Shah's great civilization collides with a black wave of religious fervor. We witness the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini, the collapse of the 2,500-year-old monarchy, and the moment Iran turned its back on the West forever.